The autumn sun of 1873 hung like a brass coin over the Wyoming grasslands, baking the wagon road into a ribbon of cracked earth that stretched toward mountains the color of old bruises. Sarah McKenna sat rigid on the bench of her covered wagon, hands wrapped tight around leather reins that had worn grooves into her palms over 3 weeks of travel. The 2 oxen plodded forward with the resignation of beasts who knew their burden and accepted it without complaint. Inside the wagon bed, secured beneath canvas that flapped and snapped in the hot wind, lay everything Sarah owned in this world. Sacks of cornmeal and dried beans. A butter churn that had belonged to her grandmother. 3 wool blankets. A cast iron skillet. A small wooden box containing her mother's wedding ring, a daguerreotype of her parents, and $23 in silver coins. It wasn't much to show for 26 years of living, but it was hers, earned through 2 years of working as a seamstress in St. Louis after the fever took both her parents within a week of each other. Sarah was a woman built for endurance rather than decoration. Tall and angular, with shoulders that suggested she'd spent time hauling water and chopping wood. Her hands were scarred from needle pricks and cooking burns. Her face was handsome rather than pretty, with a strong jaw and high cheekbones that caught the light. She wore her dark brown hair in a severe bun beneath a gray bonnet, and her dress was practical calico, faded from washing, with a leather belt cinched tight at her waist. Her eyes were the color of winter sky, pale blue and direct, the eyes of a woman who'd learned early that tears accomplished nothing. She was headed for the Montana Territory, where a cousin had written about cheap land and opportunities for those willing to work themselves near to death. Sarah figured she was already halfway to death from loneliness and grief, so the work part didn't frighten her much. The prairie rolled on, endless and indifferent. Grasshoppers clicked in the dried buffalo grass. A hawk circled high overhead, patient and hungry. Sarah had seen no other travelers for 2 days, which suited her fine. People were trouble more often than help, her father used to say, and so far life had proven him correct. That's when she spotted movement ahead. At first she thought it might be an antelope, the way it shifted between the sage bushes that dotted the roadside. But as her wagon drew closer, the shape resolved into something distinctly human. A man emerged from behind a cluster of rocks, stumbling slightly as if his legs weren't entirely reliable. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with broad shoulders that spoke of hard labor, though his frame had a hollowed-out look, as if someone had scooped away everything but the essential structure. His clothes were ruins. Brown trousers torn at the knees. A shirt that might once have been blue but was now the color of dirt and sweat. Boots held together with rawhide strips. A hat with a brim so battered it flopped like a dead bird. But it was the rifle that made Sarah's breath catch. He carried it in both hands, not quite pointing it at her but not exactly pointing it away either. Sarah's right hand moved slowly to the Winchester rifle propped beside her on the bench. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was 12, and she'd dropped a rabid dog at 30 yards just before leaving St. Louis. She wasn't what anyone would call a natural marksman, but she could hit what she aimed at if it was close enough and she had time to steady her breathing. The man stopped about 20 feet from her wagon. Close enough that she could see his face beneath the hat brim. He had dark hair, long and matted, and a beard that looked like it had been growing wild since spring. His face was lean to the point of gauntness, cheeks hollow, eyes sunken. But those eyes were clear, a dark brown that held something she hadn't expected to see. Not threat exactly, but desperation tempered with something like shame. "Ma'am." His voice came out as a rasp, dry as corn husks. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Ma'am, I don't mean you no harm. I swear it on my mother's grave. I need food. Whatever you can spare." But even as he spoke, the rifle in his hands shifted upward an inch. Not a deliberate threat, Sarah thought, but the movement of a man who'd forgotten how to ask for help without the leverage of potential violence. Sarah's fingers tightened on her own rifle, but she didn't raise it. Instead, she studied him the way she'd studied men who came into the dress shop, trying to determine if they were there to buy honestly or to grab and run. This man's stance was wrong for a practiced thief. His shoulders were hunched with embarrassment. His grip on the rifle was uncertain, as if he'd only recently decided to use it this way and wasn't entirely committed to the decision. "If you're fixing to rob me," Sarah said, her voice carrying clear across the distance, "you might want to look a touch more confident about it. You're shaking like a dog that knows he's about to get the switch." The man blinked, surprised. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. A flush crept up from beneath his collar, visible even through the dirt on his skin. "I'm not. That is, I wouldn't. I'm just." He stopped, swallowed hard. "I haven't eaten in 3 days, ma'am. Maybe 4. I lost count. There used to be a homestead 15 miles back where I could have worked for a meal, but when I got there it was burned out. Lightning strike, looked like. So I'm sorry. I know this ain't right. But I'm past the point where pride matters more than breathing." Sarah considered him. She'd seen desperation before. In the eyes of women at the poorhouse where she'd volunteered before her parents died. In the face of a man who'd begged on the street corner outside the dress shop, a veteran of the Mexican War with one leg gone and nowhere to go. Desperation had a particular look, and this man wore it like a second skin. But she'd also seen clever thieves who could counterfeit any emotion. The world was full of men who'd cut your throat for a silver dollar and sleep sound afterward. "What's in your pockets?" she asked. He looked confused. "Ma'am? Your pockets. Turn them out. If you're starving, you shouldn't have anything worth stealing from me. If you've got a pocket watch or a roll of bills, then you're a liar and I'll shoot you where you stand." For a moment he just stared at her. Then, slowly, he lowered his rifle and leaned it against a nearby rock. He pulled his pockets inside out. Empty, both of them. Nothing but lint and a hole in the seam of the right one. "Satisfied?" he asked, and there was no anger in the question, only weariness. Sarah nodded. She set her rifle down carefully, making sure he saw that she was keeping it within reach. Then she stood, turned, and climbed into the back of the wagon. She could feel his eyes on her, tracking her movements. It would be so easy for him to grab his rifle and shoot her in the back. The thought made her spine prickle, but she forced herself to move calmly, to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. She found a half-full sack of cornmeal, tied at the top with twine. A bundle of dried venison wrapped in cloth. She'd planned to make these supplies last another week at least, but plans were made to be adjusted. That was the first lesson the frontier taught, and it taught it hard. She climbed back onto the bench and tossed the items down to him. The sack landed at his feet with a soft thump. The venison bundle hit his chest and he caught it reflexively, hands trembling. "That'll keep you alive for a few days if you're smart about rationing," Sarah said. "There's a creek about 3 miles north if you follow that deer path. Water's clean enough if you boil it first." The man stood frozen, staring at the food in his hands as if it might vanish if he moved wrong. His throat worked, swallowing nothing. When he looked up at her, his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears, though no man out here would admit to crying. "Ma'am, thank you. I don't know how to. Thank you. You already said that." Sarah gathered her reins. "Now get off the road before I change my mind and shoot you for the principle of it." But as she prepared to snap the reins and set her oxen moving, the man spoke again. "Wait. Please. Just. What's your name?" Sarah paused. It was an odd question from a man who'd just been gifted his survival. But there was something in his voice, a need to anchor this moment in something real, that made her answer. "McKenna. Sarah McKenna." He repeated it slowly, as if committing it to memory. "McKenna. I'll remember that." "See that you do. If you're going to rob a woman, at least have the decency to remember who she was. Might keep you honest next time you get desperate. Something like a smile ghosted across his face, there and gone so quick she almost missed it. Yes, ma'am. He picked up his rifle, tucked the food under one arm, and turned back toward the rocks. Sarah watched him go, noting the way he favored his left leg slightly, the stiffness in his gait that spoke of old injuries or newer hunger. When he disappeared into the sagebrush, she finally allowed herself to release the breath she'd been holding. Her hands shook slightly as she snapped the reins. The oxen lurched forward, and the wagon creaked back into motion. Sarah didn't look back. Looking back was how you got killed out here. You focused on the horizon ahead and you kept moving, because stopping meant dying, simple as that. But as the afternoon wore on and the sun began its slow descent toward the mountains, Sarah found her thoughts returning to the man on the road. Something about him had lodged in her mind like a splinter. The shame in his eyes. The way he'd said her name, McKenna, like it was something valuable he'd been given to hold. She'd grown used to being invisible, just another woman struggling west, notable only for the supplies she carried. But he'd seen her. Really seen her. And that was somehow more unsettling than the rifle had been. The days that followed fell into the familiar rhythm of travel. Wake before dawn. Feed the oxen. Cook a Spartan breakfast over a small fire. Pack the wagon. Drive until the sun was high and heat made the oxen suffer, then stop for a few hours in whatever shade could be found. Drive again until near dark. Make camp. Sleep with one hand on a weapon. Repeat. Sarah reached a valley 5 days after the encounter with the stranger. It was a good place to stop, ringed with cottonwood trees that suggested reliable water, with grass thick enough to let the oxen graze. She guided the wagon off the main track and down a slight slope to where a creek ran, narrow but steady, over a bed of smooth stones. That night she made a fire and cooked beans in her iron pot, stirring them slowly while the stars emerged overhead like pinpricks in black cloth. The prairie night was never truly silent. Coyotes yipped in the distance. Insects hummed in the grass. The creek made its small music over stones. Sarah had learned to find comfort in these sounds. They meant she was alone, yes, but alone safely. The dangerous nights were the silent ones, when predators moved through the grass with intent. She was lifting the pot from the fire when she heard the footsteps. Not the four-legged kind. 2 legs, moving through the grass with the deliberate stride of a man who wanted to be heard approaching. Sarah's hand went immediately to the rifle leaning against a wagon wheel. She turned, bringing the weapon up to her shoulder in one smooth motion, and found herself pointing it at a familiar figure. The stranger from the road stood at the edge of her firelight, hands raised and empty. He looked different. Still gaunt, still dressed in rags, but there was color in his face now, and his eyes had lost that glazed desperation. He'd washed at some point, because his hair hung clean and dark to his shoulders, and his beard had been trimmed, though not shaved. "Easy, Miss McKenna," he said, and his voice was stronger now, clear and steady. "I'm not armed. See?" He turned slowly, showing her his sides, his back. No rifle. No pistol. No knife that she could see, though a man could hide a blade in a boot or waistband easy enough. "What do you want?" Sarah kept the rifle trained on his chest. At this range she couldn't miss, and he knew it. To repay a debt. He lowered his hands slowly and she saw that he carried a cloth sack in his left hand, bulging with something. In his right hand, a dead rabbit, skinned and cleaned, ready for the pot. Sarah didn't lower the rifle. "I don't recall loaning you anything that needs repaying. You gave me food when I had none. That's a debt in my book. Out here, that's the difference between breathing and dying, and I owe you for choosing breathing." He took a step closer and Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. He stopped immediately, reading her intent. "The sack," he said. "It's the cornmeal. Half of what you gave me. I ate careful and I trapped 2 rabbits, so I can spare it. And the rabbits for your supper, if you'll take it. I owe you better than arriving empty-handed. Sarah studied him in the firelight. Con men were skilled at seeming harmless, she reminded herself. But con men didn't usually return things they'd been given freely. And they certainly didn't show up offering food when they could have just kept riding. Set the sack down, she said. And the rabbit. Then back away 10 paces. He did as instructed, moving slowly and deliberately. When he'd backed away, Sarah approached the sack, rifle still ready. She nudged it with her boot. It was indeed cornmeal, maybe 3 pounds of it. The rabbit was real too, fresh killed, still slightly warm. She looked up at him, standing in the darkness just beyond her firelight. You got a name besides that fool who tried to rob me? Thomas. Thomas Garrett. Used to run a cattle ranch 40 miles north of here, back when I had cattle to run. What happened to them? Drought 2 summers ago killed the grass. The cattle starved or got sick. I sold off what was left to pay debts, but it wasn't enough. Lost the ranch to the bank in March. Been wandering since, picking up work where I could find it, which hasn't been often. Sarah absorbed this. It was a common enough story out here. The land gave and the land took away, and a man who'd been prosperous one year could be begging the next. She'd seen it happen to farmers in Missouri, watched whole families pack up and drift away after a bad harvest or a bank calling in loans. How old are you, Garrett? 32. Why? Because you look 50 and I'm trying to figure if you're lying about the ranch. He smiled, thin and humorless. Hunger and losing everything you worked for ages a man considerable. But I'm telling truth. I got papers, if you want to see them. Deed of sale for the ranch. Bill of sale for the cattle. All of it legal and proper. I don't need to see papers. A man who's lying wouldn't offer them so quick. Sarah made a decision that she knew might be stupid but felt necessary anyway. She lowered the rifle. You can approach the fire. Sit on that log there, where I can keep an eye on you. You make any move I don't like and I'll shoot you, debt or no debt. Understood. He moved into the firelight and sat where she'd indicated, hands resting on his knees, posture open and unthreatening. Sarah added the rabbit to her pot, along with some wild onions she'd dug up earlier. The smell of cooking meat filled the air, rich and savory. Her stomach growled. She hadn't had fresh meat since leaving St. Louis. You said you lost your ranch in March. It's October now. That's 7 months of wandering. How'd you survive? Thomas stared into the fire. Odd jobs when I could find them. Helped a freight company load wagons in Cheyenne for a week. Dug graves in a mining camp for room and board. Worked as a drover for a cattle drive, but that was only 2 weeks' work. Rest of the time I just walked and tried not to starve. You were the first person who showed me kindness without expecting me to break my back for it first. Kindness is a strange word for not wanting to watch a man die in the road. Maybe. But I've passed plenty of folks who'd have shot me without asking questions. You asked. That's worth something. They sat in silence while the food cooked. Sarah found herself glancing at him more than she should, noting details she'd missed during their first encounter. He had good bones beneath the gauntness. Strong jaw, straight nose, the kind of face that would photograph well if he ever found himself in a portrait studio. His hands were large and work-scarred, the hands of a man who'd known manual labor long before he'd known hardship. There was something in the way he held himself, despite the ragged clothes and the hunger, that suggested he'd once been confident, maybe even proud. When the food was ready, Sarah dished it into 2 tin plates. She handed one to Thomas and kept the other for herself. They ate without speaking, the way hungry people did, focused entirely on the miracle of hot food in their bellies. After, Sarah made coffee from her precious supply of beans, ground up and boiled bitter and strong. She poured it into 2 cups and handed one to Thomas. He accepted it with a nod of thanks, cradling the hot cup in both hands. "You can't just keep following my wagon," Sarah said abruptly. "People will talk. A woman traveling alone is one thing. A woman traveling with a man who's not her husband is another. I don't need that kind of attention." "I know." Thomas sipped his coffee, winced at the heat. "I wasn't planning to follow you. I was heading north anyway, figured I might find work in the mining camps. Just happened that your trail and mine ran close tonight, so I thought I'd make good on my debt before our paths split." "Where north?" "Montana Territory. Heard they're hiring men for the mines around Virginia City. Don't pay much but they feed you, which is more than I can say for wandering." Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. "Montana. That's where I'm headed." Thomas looked at her, surprised. "You got family there?" "A cousin. Wrote me that land was cheap and work was steady if you didn't mind breaking your back for it." "That's the truth. Montana's not kind country, but it's honest country. You work hard, you survive. You don't, you die. Simple mathematics. I've never been afraid of hard work." "I can see that." His eyes moved over her, not in the way men usually looked at women, with hunger or calculation, but with something more like respect. "A woman who travels alone with a wagon and doesn't shoot a desperate man on sight? You've got steel in you, Miss McKenna. That'll serve you well up there." The fire burned down to embers. The night deepened around them. Sarah knew she should tell him to leave, to sleep somewhere else, far enough away that propriety was maintained. But the prairie was dangerous at night, and she'd already given him food. Having him close meant 2 sets of ears listening for trouble instead of one. "You can sleep by the fire," she said finally. "But you bed down on the other side of it, and if you come near my wagon in the night I'll assume the worst and act accordingly." "Fair enough." Thomas set down his coffee cup and began gathering dry grass for a makeshift bed. Sarah climbed into her wagon and pulled the canvas flap closed behind her. She lay down on her bedroll with the rifle beside her, listening to the sounds of Thomas settling on the other side of the fire. Despite her exhaustion, sleep was slow to come. She kept thinking about the coincidence of 2 people heading to the same territory, following the same roads, both of them alone and carrying the weight of losses they couldn't quite put down. Morning came cold and gray, with mist rising from the creek. Sarah woke to find Thomas already up, tending the fire, a pot of something boiling over the flames. She climbed out of the wagon, rifle in hand more from habit than fear. "Coffee," he said, nodding at the pot. "Figured I owed you for the night's shelter. You're using my coffee beans." "I know. I'll replace them when I can." Sarah poured herself a cup and sat on the wagon tongue, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. Thomas sat across from her, sipping his own coffee, saying nothing. The silence between them was oddly comfortable, the silence of 2 people who didn't feel the need to fill every moment with words. "How far to Montana from here?" Sarah asked finally. "4 weeks if the weather holds. 6 if it doesn't. There's a trading post about 10 days north where you can resupply, but after that it's sparse until you hit the settlements. You know the trail? I drove cattle up it twice before I lost my ranch. It's not easy, but it's passable if you're careful." Sarah considered this. She'd been navigating by instinct and the occasional advice from other travelers, but having someone who actually knew the route would make the journey safer. On the other hand, traveling with a man opened her to gossip and worse. A woman's reputation was a fragile thing out here, easily broken and impossible to repair. But then, she'd left her reputation back in St. Louis along with everything else. Out here she was nobody, which meant she had the freedom to make choices that proper society would condemn. "I'm not going to ask you to travel with me," she said slowly. But if your trail and mine happen to run the same direction, and if you were to camp near me at night, I wouldn't object to it. Safety in numbers and all. Thomas looked at her steadily. You sure about that? Like you said, people talk. Let them talk. I'm headed to Montana to work myself near to death on a homestead. I don't have time to worry about what strangers think of my traveling arrangements. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, made him look younger and less haunted. You're a practical woman, Miss McKenna. Practical is what keeps you alive. Everything else is decoration. They broke camp together, Thomas helping her hitch the oxen and secure the load in her wagon. His hands knew the work instinctively, checking straps and knots with the ease of long practice. When everything was ready, he tipped his hat to her. I'll be walking north. If you happen to be going the same direction, I'll likely see you tonight. Likely so. And that's how it began, this strange partnership that wasn't quite a partnership. Thomas would disappear into the landscape ahead of her wagon, ranging out to the sides, scouting the trail. Sometimes she wouldn't see him for hours. Then he'd appear at midday with a report on what lay ahead, a good place to camp or a muddy stretch to avoid. At night he'd arrive at her fire with some contribution. Fish from a stream. Wood for burning. Once, incredibly, 3 eggs from a sage hen's nest, which they fried up and ate like they were dining on ambrosia. He never presumed. Never crowded her space. Always slept on the far side of the fire with his back turned to her wagon, giving her privacy. But he was there, a constant presence, and Sarah found herself growing accustomed to it. More than accustomed. She looked forward to the evenings when they'd sit and talk while the fire burned down. He told her about his ranch, the good years before the drought. She told him about St. Louis, about working in the dress shop, about the fever that took her parents. They traded stories like currency, each revelation bringing them incrementally closer. One night, 2 weeks into their shared journey, rain swept across the plains with violent suddenness. One moment the sky was clear and starred. The next, lightning split the darkness and thunder shook the ground. Sarah was in her wagon, securing items that might slide or break, when Thomas appeared at the back flap. Miss McKenna, you better let me in. This is going to be a bad one. Rain pounded on the canvas above them, so loud they had to raise their voices to be heard. Water began seeping through a seam, dripping onto Sarah's supplies. Thomas helped her move things, piling everything toward the center where it was drier. In the close confines of the wagon, she was acutely aware of him. The smell of wet leather and wood smoke that clung to his clothes. The heat radiating from his body. The way his shoulder brushed hers as they worked. When everything was secured, they sat near the back flap, watching the storm through the gap in the canvas. Lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, brilliant flashes. The thunder was so loud it seemed to come from inside Sarah's chest. I hate storms, she said, more to herself than to him. Why? My father was killed by lightning. Not direct hit, but the shock of it traveling through the ground. He was bringing in the horses during a thunderstorm. They found him lying in the paddock, no mark on him, but his heart had stopped. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm sorry. That's a hard way to lose someone. All ways are hard. At least it was quick. Better than fever, watching them fade over days. That how you lost your mother? Yes. Week after my father died, she took sick. I think she just gave up, couldn't face life without him. They'd been married 30 years. That's a long time to build your world around another person. Lightning flashed again, so bright it hurt to look at. In that momentary illumination, Sarah saw Thomas's face clearly. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Something between sympathy and understanding and something else, something warmer. You ever think about that? He asked. Building your life around another person? Used to. There was a man in St. Louis, a clerk at the bank. He courted me for 3 months. Proper courtship, flowers and walks on Sunday. I thought maybe he'd propose. Then my parents died and I inherited their debts along with nothing much else. He stopped calling. Turned out he'd been courting my father's position more than me. Fool, Thomas said quietly. Maybe. Or maybe he was smart. Why tie yourself to a woman with nothing when there are plenty with something? Because having nothing is temporary. Being the kind of person who'd weather it with you, that's rare. That's worth more than money. Sarah looked at him. Water dripped from his hair, ran down his face. His clothes were soaked through. He looked like a drowned rat, bedraggled and half-starved still, despite 2 weeks of better eating. And yet there was something in the way he sat, straight-backed and steady, that made him seem more solid than men she'd known who owned property and had letters after their names. You think I'm that kind of person? She asked. I know you are. You proved it the day you gave food to a man who tried to rob you. Most people would have shot me or driven past. You did neither. That tells me everything about your character. The rain hammered harder, a crescendo that made conversation impossible. They sat in silence, shoulders touching now, sharing warmth. Sarah felt something shift inside her, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. She'd been alone for so long, carrying everything herself. The weight of her parents' deaths. The fear of the journey. The uncertainty of what waited in Montana. And here was a man offering to help carry some of it, asking nothing in return except the right to walk the same road. When the storm finally passed, moving east toward the sunrise, Thomas made to leave the wagon. Sarah's hand shot out, catching his arm. Stay, she said. He turned, surprised. Ma'am? Sarah. My name is Sarah. And I'm asking you to stay. Not out there by the fire. Here. With me. She saw him understand what she was offering. Saw the war in his eyes between what was proper and what was necessary. Between the man he'd been raised to be and the man circumstances had made him. Sarah, he said carefully. I'm not going to take advantage of you because of a storm and a moment's loneliness. That's not who I am. I know. That's why I'm asking. If I thought you were that kind of man, you'd still be out there in the rain. He searched her face, looking for doubt or fear. She met his gaze steadily, letting him see that she meant it. That she was choosing this with clear eyes and full knowledge. Slowly, Thomas nodded. He didn't reach for her, didn't presume. He simply settled back against the wagon side, giving her space to change her mind. Sarah found a blanket, mostly dry, and spread it over them both. In the darkness of the wagon, with rain still pattering softly on canvas, she shifted closer until her head rested against his shoulder. His arm came around her, careful and gentle, as if she might break. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong. Could feel the tension in his body, the wariness of a man who'd been hurt and was afraid of being hurt again. I'm not promising anything, Sarah said quietly. I don't know what I want beyond making it to Montana and surviving whatever comes next. I'm not asking for promises. I'm just grateful to be here, in this moment, with you. They fell asleep that way, two broken people finding comfort in proximity and shared warmth. And when Sarah woke at dawn, she felt something she hadn't felt since before her parents died. Not happiness, exactly, but the possibility of it. The sense that maybe, just maybe, the world held more than grief and struggle. The days that followed took on a different quality. Thomas still ranged ahead, still scouted and hunted and kept his distance during the day. But at night he slept in the wagon, and they talked until sleep claimed them. They didn't make any declarations. Didn't use words like love or future. But something was building between them, solid and sure as a foundation being laid stone by stone. 3 weeks into their journey, trouble found them. Sarah had stopped to water the oxen at a creek crossing when two men appeared from upstream. They rode ragged horses and had the look of men who'd been living rough for a while. One was older, maybe 45, with a scarred face and small mean eyes. The other was younger, probably not yet 25, but there was a viciousness in him that age couldn't temper. "Well now," the older one said, reining in his horse. "What do we have here?" "A wagon all alone." "That's mighty careless, ma'am." Sarah's hand went to the rifle tucked under the wagon seat. "I'm not alone. My husband is hunting just upstream. He'll be back any moment." The younger one laughed. "Don't see no tracks but yours and these oxen. Don't see no evidence of any husband. Believe what you want. But I'm telling you to ride on." The older man dismounted. His hand rested on the pistol at his hip. "Maybe we will. But first maybe you show us what you got in that wagon. We're reasonable men. We see something we like, we'll offer fair trade." "I'm not trading anything. Get back on your horse and leave." But they kept coming, circling the wagon like wolves testing a fence. Sarah pulled out the rifle and aimed it at the older man's chest. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. "Last warning. I will shoot you. You ain't going to shoot nobody, lady. Women don't have the stomach for." The crack of a gunshot cut him off. The older man yelped and grabbed his ear, which was now missing a piece. Blood ran down his neck. Both men whirled to see Thomas standing 30 yards upstream, rifle to his shoulder, already working the lever to chamber another round. "Next one goes in your chest, not your ear," Thomas called out, his voice carrying clear and cold across the water. "You got 3 seconds to mount up and ride out of here." 1. The men scrambled for their horses, the older one cursing and pressing his hand to his bleeding ear. "You'll regret this. We got friends." 2. They were in their saddles, wheeling their horses around. Thomas's rifle tracked them steadily. 3. They kicked their horses into a gallop and disappeared into the brush, leaving nothing but dust and the echo of hoofbeats. Thomas lowered his rifle and walked to the wagon. His face was grim, carved from stone. "You all right?" Sarah realized she was shaking. "Yes. I think. Yes. You did good. Didn't panic. But we need to move camp. Those types sometimes have friends, and they'll work up their courage to try again if we stay here." They pushed on for another 5 miles before Thomas declared a spot defensible enough for nightfall. Sarah made dinner but could barely eat. The adrenaline had left her feeling hollow and strange, like she was watching herself from outside her own body. That night, Thomas sat closer than usual, rifle across his knees, watching the darkness. Sarah sat beside him, her own rifle ready. "You could have killed them," she said. "Yes. Why didn't you?" "Because killing changes a man. I've shot rabid animals and dying cattle, but I've never shot a person. Didn't want to start today unless there was no other choice." "You were protecting me." "Yes." He looked at her then, and in the firelight his eyes were fierce and tender at once. "I'd do worse than shoot a man to keep you safe, Sarah. I need you to know that. I'm not a violent man by nature, but I've found something out here that I didn't expect to find. Something worth protecting with everything I have." Sarah's throat tightened. "Thomas. You don't have to say anything. I know we've only known each other a few weeks. I know I'm not much to look at, got nothing to my name but the clothes on my back and a rifle I borrowed from a man who died owing me wages. But I need you to understand. What I feel for you, it's not gratitude and it's not loneliness. It's something I thought I'd lost the capacity for after I lost everything else." Sarah reached across the space between them and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, rough and warm and solid. "I know," she said quietly. "I feel it too. I've been trying not to, trying to be practical about it. But after today, after watching you stand between me and harm, I can't pretend anymore. I don't want to. What are you saying? I'm saying that when we get to Montana, I don't want to go to my cousin's homestead alone. I'm saying that maybe we could find a piece of land together. Build something together. Not because we're desperate or lonely, but because we choose to. Because we fit together in a way that makes sense, even when nothing else does. Thomas's hand tightened on hers. You'd tie yourself to a man with nothing? No prospects, no property, no promise of anything but hard work and uncertainty? You're not a man with nothing. You're a man who knows how to work, how to survive, how to stand steady when things go bad. You're a man who shoots to warn instead of kill. Who returns borrowed flour and brings rabbits to campfires. Who sleeps on the far side of the fire to protect a woman's reputation even when she's invited you closer. That's not nothing, Thomas. That's everything that matters. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, gentle as prayer. Sarah McKenna. I'll remember that name until the day I die. And if you'll have me, I'll make sure it's the only name that matters for the rest of my life. I'll have you. God help us both, but I'll have you. They sat like that, hands clasped, while the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead. And somewhere in that vast darkness, Sarah felt the last of her fear dissolve. Not the practical fear that kept you alive on the frontier, but the deeper fear that said she'd always be alone, that connection was something that happened to other people but never to her. The remaining days of the journey passed in a blur of miles and weather. They crossed rivers swollen with autumn rain. Navigated rocky passes where the wagon threatened to tip. Sheltered from an early snow that dusted the landscape white and disappeared by noon. Through it all, Thomas and Sarah moved as a unit, anticipating each other's needs, working together with the seamless coordination of people who'd been partners for years rather than weeks. They reached the trading post Thomas had mentioned in mid-November, a rough collection of buildings huddled against the approaching winter. Sarah sold some of her supplies to replenish what they'd used, and with the money left over she bought two things. A bolt of good wool cloth. And a plain gold ring from a prospector who'd given up on the mines and was selling everything he owned for passage back east. That night, in a rough hotel room that cost more than Sarah wanted to spend but felt necessary, she gave the ring to Thomas. I'm not asking you to marry me proper, she said. Not yet. There's no preacher here and I don't want a ceremony that means nothing. But I want you to have this. I want people to see you wearing it and know you're spoken for. That we're building towards something permanent. Thomas turned the ring over in his fingers. It was scratched and worn, clearly second-hand, but it caught the lamplight and gleamed. You sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything. He slipped it onto his finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for him all along. Then he pulled Sarah close and kissed her, slow and deep, a kiss that tasted of promises and possibility. They reached Montana territory 2 weeks later, just as the first real snow began to fall. Sarah's cousin lived in a settlement called Bitterroot, 30 miles south of where they emerged from the mountains. The land around the settlement was harsh but beautiful, all rolling hills and pine forests with mountains rising purple in the distance. Sarah's cousin, Mary, was a tough woman in her 40s, weathered by wind and work but still strong. She took one look at Sarah and Thomas standing together on her porch and smiled knowingly. So you found yourself a husband on the trail, did you? Not yet, Sarah said. But we're working toward it. Mary nodded. Good. A woman alone out here is a target for every drifter and claim jumper within 50 miles. But a man and woman together, that's a partnership that can hold land and build something worth keeping. She set them up in a small cabin on the edge of her property, little more than 4 walls and a roof but weatherproof and sturdy. Over the next few weeks, Thomas helped Mary's husband with winter preparations while Sarah worked alongside Mary, learning the rhythms of frontier life. How to preserve meat. How to bank a fire so it lasted through the night. How to read the sky for coming weather. In December, a circuit preacher came through Bitterroot. He was an old man with white hair and hands twisted by arthritis, but his voice was strong when he spoke of faith and commitment. Sarah and Thomas were married in Mary's kitchen, with Mary and her husband as witnesses. There were no flowers, no fancy dress, no guests beyond the family. But when Thomas slipped a second ring onto Sarah's finger, one he'd made himself from a silver dollar hammered flat and carved with careful attention, Sarah felt more married than any church ceremony could have made her. Sarah Garrett, the preacher pronounced. And Thomas Garrett. May you build a life together that honors God and endures through all hardship. That night, in their small cabin, Thomas built up the fire until the room glowed warm. He turned to Sarah, his wife now in name and law and every way that mattered. I never thought I'd have this again, he said. A home. A partner. A future worth fighting for. When I lost my ranch, I thought I'd lost my chance at any of it. But you gave it back to me, Sarah. You saved my life in more ways than just food on a road. You saved mine too. I was so lonely I thought I'd die of it. And then you stumbled out of those sage bushes, desperate and half-starved, and somehow that was exactly what I needed. Someone who understood what it meant to lose everything and keep walking anyway. They made love that night with the tenderness of people who'd learned that everything could be taken away in an instant, and therefore what you had right now was precious beyond measure. And afterward, lying in each other's arms while snow fell soft outside, Sarah thought about the strange path that had led her here. Her parents' death. The long wagon journey. A desperate man on a dusty road. All of it necessary, all of it leading to this moment, this place, this person. Spring came eventually, as it always did, transforming the landscape from white silence to green abundance. Thomas and Sarah filed a homestead claim on 160 acres 10 miles from Mary's place, land that had good water and timber and soil that might, with enough work, yield crops. They built a cabin together, Thomas felling trees and Sarah notching logs, both of them working until their backs ached and their hands bled. The land was hard. The work was endless. There were days when Sarah wondered if they'd made a terrible mistake, if they'd survived the first winter in their new home. But every night Thomas was there, solid and steady, and every morning they woke up and kept building, kept planting, kept moving forward. In August, Sarah realized she was pregnant. She told Thomas one evening after dinner, watching his face carefully for his reaction. He was silent for a long moment, processing. Then he pulled her close and buried his face in her hair. A child, he whispered. Dear God, Sarah. A child. Are you happy? Happy doesn't begin to cover it. Terrified, yes. We've got so little, and a baby needs so much. But happy? I'm so happy I could burst with it. Their son was born the following April, during a late spring snowstorm. Mary came to help with the birth, her experienced hands guiding Sarah through hours of labor that felt like they'd never end. But when the baby finally came, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Sarah held him and wept with relief and joy and exhaustion. Thomas held his son for the first time with hands that trembled. The baby was impossibly small, impossibly fragile, and Sarah saw fear flicker across Thomas's face. What if I'm not enough? He asked quietly. What if I can't provide for him the way he needs? You're enough. You've always been enough. We'll figure it out together, the same way we've figured out everything else. They named him James, after Sarah's father. And as Sarah watched Thomas walk the floor with their son, singing old songs in a rough voice while the baby slept against his shoulder, she thought about how far they'd both come. From that dusty road where desperation had brought them together. Through storms and threats and endless miles. To this cabin, this life, this family they'd built from nothing but determination and love. Years passed. They added 2 more children, both daughters, and expanded the cabin to accommodate their growing family. Thomas proved to be exactly what Sarah had always believed him to be: steady, hard-working, devoted. He taught James to ride and hunt. He braided the girls' hair in the mornings before school. He held Sarah on nights when the loneliness of the frontier threatened to overwhelm her, when she missed her parents or worried about money or feared that everything they'd built might collapse. But it didn't collapse. It grew, slowly and steadily, season by season, year by year. The homestead became profitable. They added cattle, a small herd at first, then larger. Thomas's reputation for honest dealing spread, and people sought him out to buy stock or ask advice. Sarah took in sewing when time permitted, her old skills from the dress shop proving useful in a settlement where women needed clothes mended and wedding dresses made. On their 10th anniversary, Thomas took Sarah out to the ridge that overlooked their land. It was summer, and the valley below was green and gold, their cabin small but sturdy in the middle of fields they'd carved from wilderness. 10 years, Thomas said, his arm around her waist. Sometimes I can't believe we made it this long. Sometimes I can't believe we made it past that first meeting. I should have shot you. He laughed. Probably. I was robbing you, after all. You were asking for help and couldn't quite manage it. There's a difference. You saw that? Even then? I saw a man who was ashamed of what he was doing. Men who are truly dangerous don't feel shame. They just take. Thomas turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. His face had filled out over the years, though he'd never lost the lean look of someone who worked hard. Gray threaded through his dark hair now. Lines creased the corners of his eyes. But when he looked at her, she still saw the man from the road, desperate and grateful and fierce all at once. I never forgot your name, he said. McKenna. Sarah McKenna. That's what you were when I met you, and even though you're Sarah Garrett now, I still remember. I'll always remember the woman who gave food to a stranger and changed everything. And I'll always remember Thomas Garrett, the man who returned borrowed flour and brought rabbits to my campfire. The man who stood between me and harm. The man who became my partner in every way that matters. They stood on that ridge as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson and deep purple. Below them, their children played in the yard, their voices carrying clear in the evening air. And Sarah thought about roads and choices and the strange mathematics of fate that had brought two broken people together and made them whole. She'd lost her parents. Thomas had lost his ranch. They'd both lost the lives they'd thought they'd have. But in that losing, they'd found each other. And that, Sarah thought, was worth every hard mile, every moment of fear, every sacrifice made along the way. I love you, she said, the words coming easy after 10 years of saying them. I loved you when you were nothing but a stranger on a road. I loved you when you were a partner on a wagon trail. And I love you now, as the father of my children and the builder of this life we've made. Thomas kissed her, soft and sure, a kiss that tasted of home and history and promises kept. And I love you, Sarah. You saved me in every way a person can be saved. And I'll spend the rest of my life being grateful for it. They walked back down the ridge together as dusk settled over the valley. Inside the cabin, Mary had dinner waiting. The children would need to be fed and settled for the night. There was work to be done tomorrow, and the day after, and every day stretching forward into a future they'd built with their own hands. But for now, in this moment, there was just the two of them walking home together through the gathering dark, their hands clasped tight, their steps matched perfectly after so many years of walking the same road. And somewhere out on the plains, on a dusty wagon trail that neither of them would ever travel again, the memory of a desperate man and a brave woman lingered like a ghost. A reminder that sometimes salvation comes in unexpected forms. That sometimes the people we're supposed to fear are the people we most need to save us. And that sometimes, in the wild and unforgiving heart of the frontier, two strangers can meet and forge something stronger than steel, more enduring than stone. A partnership. A love. A life worth living.